Hi, welcome to Ballotpedia's webinar on the California Top 2 primary
I want to answer my phone, but I can't stop it from ringing 3 times, then it'll be quiet.
system. Okay, thank you. So we'll just wait for that to stop.
Yeah.
So yes, welcome to Ballotpedia's webinar on the Top 2 primary system in California. Today we are joined by Richard Winger. He is the publisher and editor of Ballot Access News. He is an advocate for minor political parties' ballot access and has testified on related issues in multiple court cases. We may also be joined at some point by Steve Peace. Steve is a former state legislator and co-founder of the Independent Voter Network. He was the lead author of Proposition 14, the ballot measure that voters approved in 2010 to create the Top 2 primary system. Just to provide a quick overview of the Top 2 primary system, a Top 2 primary is a type of primary election in which all candidates are listed on the same primary ballot. The top 2 vote getters, regardless of their partisan affiliations, advance to the general election. In 2010, voters in California approved Proposition 14, a constitutional amendment to enact a Top 2 system in the state. So we actually just had a Top 2 primary election in California 2 days ago on Tuesday, June 5th, 2018. Richard, my question for you is, what is your general reaction to how the Top 2 system worked on June 5th? Would this election have looked differently if the state was using a partisan primary system?
Well, first I want to say if the state had used a partisan primary system, it could have used any of 4 types. And part of the answer to the question depends on which other kind of primary system we were using. There's 4 kinds. There's closed primaries, open primaries, semi-closed primaries, and blanket primaries. And those are all different from Top 2. And the LA Times seems to think that California only has a choice of 2 kinds of primary, Top 2 or some kind that excludes independents. And that's a real problem. It's a real misconception. And part of what I hope to get across today is that there's 5 kinds of primary. But having said that, I think if we had used any type of partisan primary, we would have seen 3 differences. I think we would have seen higher turnout, and I'll explain why in just a second. I think the quality of the campaign messages would have been much higher. I'll explain that. And I think we would have had better candidates. So why do I think we would have had higher turnout with a partisan primary system? Well, for one thing, there's the bare fact that the Top 2 primary of 2014 had the lowest primary turnout in California history. Only 25% of the registered voters participated. This one, according to political data, and Paul Mitchell, he's the expert, he thinks it's going to come in at 31%. If he's right, that'll make this Top 2 primary the 2nd lowest in California history for midterm primaries. I saw a story analyzing why people don't vote. Remember, all voters in California who are registered get a booklet in the mail giving them information about the issues and the candidates. It's very easy to vote, and yet, out of the 100% of registered voters who got this book in the mail, only 31% participated. So the reporter set out to ask why. And he said lots of people said, with 32 candidates in the ballot for Senate and 27 for governor, I don't want to vote unless I can do a good job. And I just don't have time and energy to study up on all these candidates. Another reason that would have been different, I said better attention to issues. I think John Myers of the LA Times said it best. He said yesterday, the rules of the Top 2 primary seemed almost to eclipse everything else about the campaigns being waged this year. The big newspapers were obsessed with the gamesmanship. Which 2 people were going to come in first and second? Were the Democrats going to be left without a candidate on the ballot in House races that they could potentially win in November if they could just get on? Were the Republicans going to have a Republican candidate for governor or not? That crowded out discussion of the issues. It also caused millions of dollars of advertising, especially from Democrats and their allies, trying to game the top two system. Millions of dollars were spent by Gavin Newsom and his allies trying to persuade Republicans to vote for John Cox and not Alan Travis. And millions were spent by Villaraigosa and his allies trying to persuade Republicans to vote for Travis Allen and not John Cox. These were insincere ads. They were just trying to manipulate the system. They were trying to manipulate who came in second. And then I also said if we'd used a partisan primary system, we would have had better candidates. This is true for the Republicans and the minor parties. If the Republicans were guaranteed that the one Republican would be in the general election ballot, they surely could have come up with a strong candidate for US Senate. There are many Republican mayors in California, including mayors of large cities like San Diego and Fresno. There's Republican legislators. I think if the Republicans knew they could get on the general election ballot for Senate regardless, because the top voting Republican in the Republican primary would make it, that would have attracted high quality Republicans to run for Senate. And for the minor parties, it's even truer. There's all kinds of wonderful minor party candidates in the past in this state who've contributed to our dialogue. And I'm not criticizing the minor party candidates that actually filed this year, but I just want to review a list of some of the outstanding candidates that have run for minor parties in California in the recent past. We had a Superior Court judge, Jim Gray, who was an absolute expert on drug decriminalization. He was a past Libertarian candidate for US Senate. We had Steve Cubby, a past Libertarian candidate for governor, who pioneered the medical marijuana movement because at a young age, he was told he had completely incurable cancer from kidneys to liver. He was told he absolutely could not live, but he took massive amounts of marijuana and he's still alive. And so he went on a crusade to publicize the idea of medical marijuana. And he succeeded. Now that's policy. It took decades. Well, he ran for governor and he helped spread that idea around. And I've just been talking about libertarians so far. Now I'm going to switch to the Green Party. Remember Peter Cameo? He got over 5% for governor in 2002 for the Greens. He was an investment counselor, and he pioneered the idea that in investments in socially responsible companies could actually make more money than traditional investing. And he was a charismatic person, and he really helped California by his involvement in 3 of our gubernatorial campaigns. There's Mike Feinstein, who's been mayor of Santa Monica. There's Dan Hamburg, who was the Green Party candidate for governor in 1998. He is now a county supervisor in Mendocino County, and he's a former congressman. We had Ellen Brown, who was the Green Party candidate for treasurer. She's an expert in why it's a good idea for California to create a state bank. We had Luis J. Rodriguez, the Green Party candidate for governor in 2014. He was a juvenile delinquent when he was young. He was in the gangs. He served time in prison. He so rehabilitated himself that he's written many books and had a huge influence on helping to turn gang members in Los Angeles around. And he was named the Poet Laureate of Los Angeles in 2016. And when he had Gail McLaughlin, who was happy in the Green Party, and she served as mayor of Richmond. All those years she was in the Green Party. She did run for lieutenant governor, but she was afraid if she ran as a Green, she had no chance of making it to November. So she switched her registration to independent, which didn't help her. So I don't want to go on and on here. I'm just trying to get across the point that there are a lot of talented, capable, idealistic people in the third parties, and it's just wrong to shut them out.
Thanks, Richard. So you kind of touched on this already a little bit in your comments, But obviously, leading up to the election on June 5th, we saw lots of reports that Democrats and Republicans were concerned about the top two system. Democrats were concerned that their candidates were going to be locked out of congressional races that they would otherwise be competitive in. Republicans were concerned that top two would lock them out of top ballot races, such as the gubernatorial election, which could decrease turnout down ballot. In the end, Democrats are not locked out of any potentially competitive congressional races, and Republicans have a candidate in the gubernatorial election, but not the U.S. Senate election. Nonetheless, how do you respond to these concerns from the two major parties?
I will point out that there is one race this year that the Republicans are being cheated out of. That's the 76th Assembly District race. That's in northern San Diego County. This Assembly District is so Republican that in each of the previous three elections under the top two system, the voters in November saw two Republicans on the general election ballot. In other words, in 2012, 2014, 2016, the Democrats were so weak in that district, not once could they even put somebody on the general election ballot. Well, this time, the seat was empty. 6 Republicans filed, 2 Democrats filed, and guess what? The 2 Democrats came in first and second because the 6 Republicans split up the Republican vote. So the voters must elect a Democrat. They have no choice in the matter, even though it really is a Republican district. And because of this one race, if none of the other seats switch, the Democrats will regain their supermajority in the Assembly, which they lack now by 1 vote. So it's still a problem.
Great, thanks. And we did receive notice from Steve that he will be on shortly. So we'll return to that question specifically for him as well. But in the meantime, a lot of some other commentary that appeared both in local and national media was about our current party leaders, including House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi and House Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy, that both of them oppose the top two system. Richard, how do you expect the next generation of political leaders to view the top two system? To maintain kind of that status quo, or to be more opposed or more supportive?
Well, not all future political leaders are identical. I think they're the kind of future political leaders that are really plugged into the Democratic and Republican parties. Maybe they're making their career in politics with the major parties. They'll probably support the top two system because it clearly strengthens the Democratic and Republican parties by blocking other parties that could compete, not equally, but the Libertarian Party especially is gaining. It's got 4 state legislators around the country. Every registration tally in California, the share of the Libertarian Party registration goes up. The news media never mentions that. Now I lost my train of thought. Oh yes, then there's the other kind of future political leaders that are convinced that they don't like the two-party system, and I think they will fight the top two system.
Thanks.
Maybe I should give you a hand signal when I'm done.
No, you're coming in fine on my end. Maybe it's just some kind of delayed reaction.
Okay.
So one thing we have heard from political leaders in the state of California, specifically Eric Ballman, who is the California Democratic Party's chairperson, is that state Democrats are planning to push a repeal of the top two system in 2020. That's what he told a journalist at The Atlantic just a few days ago. Given the frustration of Democratic leaders, do you expect legislative Democrats to go through with this plan? And would you expect legislative Republicans to also back it?
Constitutional amendments in the legislature need a 2/3 vote in each house. And I think the only chance for a reform measure to get through with 2/3 is restoring the blanket primary. We could restore the blanket primary if we change it a little bit. Just to refresh everybody's memory, California had a blanket primary in 1998 and 2000, and people liked it. But in June 2000, the Supreme Court said it's unconstitutional to force parties to let outsiders help choose their nominees. But we could bring it back if we say it's not mandatory. Parties are invited to participate in a blanket primary, but if they don't like it, they can nominate by convention. I'm sure the Democratic and the Republican parties would love to have a blanket primary again. Maybe people need to be reminded what a blanket primary is. A blanket primary puts all candidates from all parties on the primary ballot, although not the independents. They petition onto the general election. So it also makes for a crowded primary ballot, but not as crowded as it would be under our current system. I think the voters would vote for that overwhelmingly because it keeps the same kind of primary ballot where every voter gets to choose among all party candidates. It's almost the same. But the top vote getter from each party then goes in the general election ballot, and independents petition. So it's got all the advantages of the top two system and gets rid of the biggest disadvantage of the top two system, the biggest disadvantage meaning a terribly restricted choice in November. So I think if that idea takes hold, that could get through the legislature, and I think the voters would pass it.
Yeah, so that was actually part two of that question. So to amend the state constitution, a 2/3 vote is required in each chamber, as you said. Even if enough legislators supported an amendment to repeal the top two system, would you expect voters to approve or reject the amendment? It sounds like you suspect that they might approve the amendment. Why do you believe that?
Well, when the blanket primary initiative, Prop 198, passed in 1996, it was very popular. I didn't look up the margin, but I think it was over 60%.
Great,
this is
thanks.
Steve, guys.
Great, so we now have Steve on the call as well. So Steve, just to catch you up, Richard has been discussing the top two primary system, specifically how party leaders view it, how voters view it, and what some of the critiques of the top two primary system are. So to bring you back to one of our earlier questions, we saw that leading up to the election on June 5th, both Democrats and Republicans expressed concerns about the top two system. Democrats were concerned about their candidates being locked out of congressional races that their party could have otherwise been competitive in. And Republicans were concerned that the top two could lock them out of top ballot races, such as the gubernatorial election. In the end, Democrats were not locked out of any potentially competitive congressional races, and Republicans do have a candidate in the gubernatorial election, but not the U.S. Senate election. And as Richard pointed out, there was an assembly district in San Diego County where two Democrats did end up on the ballot for the general election, and what otherwise could have been very competitive for Republicans. So how do you respond to these concerns from the two major parties?
First, happy to join you. I apologize for being late. Pretty simple. Elections are about people. They're about voters. They're not about political parties. And the right to vote and the right to participate and select a candidate of your choice is a civil right of a citizen of the United States. The parties concerned and the people who are activists involved in politics and people that are insiders in politics, and which I was one for many years, tend to, and that includes the reporters and professors, they all start from the premise of the political party being the first party of interest. The reason why California's blanket primary was ruled unconstitutional was because the private corporations, the Democratic corporation and the Republican corporation, have a right of private association. And in any partisan system, the right of private association will allow the parties to dictate the terms of the election. We believe that as a civil right, an individual voter that should not be compelled to join an organization in order to have an equal voting right with every other citizen. And so there are many different kinds of nonpartisan systems and proposals that include things like ranked choice and other, that can be on a nonpartisan basis, that afford the civil right to vote to the individual citizen without compelling them to associate, that we are very supportive of and will continue to promote. As it relates to the specific reform in California, when we authored it, and we said then we wanted to give it a decade of experience, and we're spectacularly happy with its result. And the periodic displeasure of Washington insiders and political operatives in the political parties over it is the evidence of its dramatic success. It's spectacularly popular with the voters. It's spectacularly unpopular with politicians and their consultants and political operatives. Probably the most interesting learning curve issue that I didn't anticipate, though, was how obstinate the professional political consultants, the political industrial complex, has been in perpetuating the use of stale and old partisan messaging, as well as stale and old media tools to communicate with voters, which is interesting. I could walk down every single one of the races that involved, for example, concerns leading into the election where there were, quote unquote, too many Democrats running, and oh my gosh, we might end up with no Democrat on the ballot, where any one of the candidates who finished third, fourth, fifth could have guaranteed a number 2 spot simply by campaigning to the independent voters in their district and talking to them about issues and about the condition of the country that they're interested in, instead of simply regurgitating the nationally driven pablum that comes off of the polling data of the partisans. Independents make a choice to become independents specifically because they're unimpressed with the narrow, contrived narrative of both the Republican and Democratic parties, and they made a conscious decision not to join third parties as well. But as long as the political consultants make their money and regurgitate the same tactics as they have under partisan systems, they have a hard time figuring out how to compete in California. And so at this juncture, the independent vote kind of distributes itself, despite the stale, old, and unappealing narrative from either side. But at some point, somebody will get smarter than they've been to this point. Smarter, which is the reason I suspect the political consultants don't bother to do so. But at some point, there'll be, a candidate from either the Democratic or Republican side that'll decide to speak to people instead of to the narrow interest of the very small portion of the American electorate that are politically obsessed, and actually find the sport of the competitive arena more interesting than the consequence of governance. We tend to lose track that what we're trying to arrive at here is a system that provides for a reasonable amount of competition in which people can select people, then go and deal with reasoned differences of opinion and result in good governance. What we find already in California, as I predicted at the front end of this, having been a politician who lived in every one of these, they're under closed primaries, under semi-open primaries, under blanket primaries, and all the above. What's really important is not whether a Democrat gets elected or a Republican gets elected or a liberal gets elected or a moderate gets elected or a conservative gets elected. What's important is how they behave after they get elected. I never felt that it would have a tremendous change in the outcome of who gets elected, but it absolutely dramatically changes their behavior when they get elected, because you no longer have a system in which the elected official is the captive of the hysterical threats that come from the special interests on either the Democratic side or the other side if they want to step out and vote independently. We've seen that in California, and if we had a nonpartisan system nationwide, you'd see it even more. What you're seeing now is sort of the awkward interface between a partisan United States, a political system that's rooted in the principle that the political parties are in charge first and the people themselves are secondary to the political parties, versus the state of Washington, California, who have openly embraced the notion that voters, individuals, own the political system and they ought to determine how those systems work. The public is happy in the state of Washington. The public is happy in the state of California. The only people that are unhappy are political operatives, political scientists who've got the blinders on and look at the system. And candidly, they also typically have, you find out they have grants that come from either labor unions or business interests or the political parties themselves. And you realize why all their academic work actually is doing the bidding of the political parties. So, it's 200 years of evolution of a constitutional system that started out in the hopes that factions, as our forefathers referred to them, would be diminished in a non-parliamentary system. And the big tent parties evolved over time, and then they both went to war in courtrooms, typically together with Republican lawyers standing next to Democratic lawyers, and they began to rig these private political party primaries in such a way that they just absolutely disengaged themselves from the public at large. There's a reason why you have, in fact, for example, the current narrative is to try and brand the California open primary as a jungle primary. It's not. The only jungle primary system in the United States is in Louisiana. It's a partisan-based system. It's fundamentally different. But let me just put it this way. Fine. Maybe it takes to feed a swamp.
Steve, thanks for chiming in on that. I want to pivot to some questions that I already asked Richard, and then I will go back to asking you both similar questions. So Richard and I discussed kind of the future expectations of the top two primary system and how the parties might respond to it. So we specifically saw recently Eric Ballman, the California Democratic Party's chairperson, told The Atlantic that state Democrats are planning a push to repeal the top two system in 2020. As Proposition 14 was passed as a constitutional amendment that would require a 2/3 vote in each chamber of the state legislature and voter approval at the ballot box. Given statements from party leaders, do you expect legislative Democrats to actually go through with this plan? Do you expect legislative Republicans to also back a repeal plan? And if the parties do back a repeal with a 2/3 majority, do you expect voters to approve or reject such an amendment?
I do expect there to be serious efforts to attempt to put a repeal measure on the ballot. There actually have been secret efforts to do that in each of the years since the measure has passed. Late in the legislative session, leadership has attempted, or certain interest groups have attempted to sneak that through the legislature and put it on the ballot. I see that it is going to happen every year. The partisan interest will not give up. They'll keep going. The odds of them getting the votes out of the legislature are probably, I wouldn't want to characterize them. I think most people think it would be difficult. I'm not so sure that when you have all the special interest groups that fund their campaigns lining up behind them and telling them to do it, I'm not so sure they won't put it on the ballot and then simply say, that we'll let the voters decide. It's not hard for a politician to embrace putting something on the ballot because they can always say, I'm for voter choice. Now, as to what would happen in the event they put it on the ballot, any effort to go back to a partisan primary would be roundly defeated. All the polling, and we keep track of it on an almost daily basis, and with each election cycle, open primary gets more and more popular. And it's really difficult to go back in a state where the largest growing party in our state are people choosing not to grow up to be in a party, and you want to go and tell them you do not have the right to vote in a primary, or we're going to give the question of whether you get to vote over to a private corporation called the Democratic Party, or another private corporation called the Libertarian Party, or another private corporation called the Democratic Party. And we need to remind ourselves, we tend to give these guys a pass because we think, well, it's a Democratic Party and the Republican. These are private organizations, private corporations who have gone to court and vigorously defended their private rights as being higher rights than individual voters, and making individual voter rights subservient to those political corporations. So if anybody thinks they want to run a campaign in California defending the right the political rights of corporations over the political rights and the voting rights of individual voters, we're happy to take that on, and we're extremely confident of winning that fight.
Great. So we have enough time for one more question. Richard, I would like to start with you on this question. So we heard some positive and negative critiques from the two of you regarding the top two system. Richard, do you believe that there is an alternative electoral policy that would satisfy a number of the positive and negative critiques made surrounding top two?
I think this Ballotpedia event would be historic if Steve Peace and I could agree on a solution. And I think that's possible. I sent him a postal letter about 2 weeks ago, and I invite him to support restoring the blanket primary. I explained how we could do it. The blanket primary has the huge advantage of overcoming the terrible restriction of voter choice in November. Steve talks a lot about the rights of voters, but he will not talk about how the existing system hurts the rights of voters in November. For California, by law, to say there can only be 2 candidates in the election itself is the biggest restriction on voter choice in any democratic place in the world. Even Washington State gives people a choice in November because they have write-in space in the ballot in November. It's wrong to tell people that they must choose one of only 2 candidates in the election itself. And the reason I say it's the election itself in November is since 1872, Congress has told the states, you will hold your congressional elections in every district in November. And when Louisiana wasn't doing that, the Supreme Court told them to stop. So Louisiana did a smart thing. They abolished primaries. Everybody runs in November. And if nobody gets 50%. But anyway, I appeal to Steve, bring back voter choice in November, but keep the unified primary ballot that you love so much. That's what a blanket primary does. Let's get together on this.
Well, the blanket primary has been ruled unconstitutional. I supported it. I publicly supported it when it was put in place in California. Unfortunately, the Democratic Party and Democrat D. Jones led both parties in challenging California's blanket primary and won in the Supreme Court. I'll tell you what, though, Richard, I think we could come to agreement. Just yesterday, we announced that Independent Voter Project is part of a coalition of 8 voter reform groups throughout the nation, including Fair Vote, that are sponsoring model legislation, not only in California, but we will take it to the Conference of State Legislatures throughout the nation to go to a top 4 ranked choice system. Under that system, we would the top 4 vote getters in the primary would move on to November, and then we would use a ranked choice voting system in November in order to assure that one candidate gets over the 51% threshold. This would allow for third-party candidates higher statistical likelihood of getting to November. It preserves the ability of non-affiliated candidates to run in the primary. One of the other problems with blanket primaries, Richard, as you know, you have a ballot access problem for candidates who don't want to join a party. If you want to run as an independent, even in a blanket primary, you can't get on the ballot in the primary. You have to petition to get on the ballot in November, and by that time, your opponents have spent all this time campaigning, and you haven't. For example, there's an independent running for governor in Kansas this year, Greg Arbin. And Greg has to sit out the primary process while the partisans duke it out and raise their name ID, and he won't be able to actually formally engage in the process until he qualifies for November. That puts nonpartisan candidates who, like many voters, increasingly don't want to join any of these private organizations, be ruled from the top. It puts them at a disadvantage, and that in turn disenfranchises the independent voters who would be most likely to support their candidacies with enthusiasm. So you'd like to join Independent Voter Project, Fair Vote, and the rest of the NANR has now voted. The National Association of Nonpartisan Reform Organization has voted unanimously to support this model legislation, top 4 ranked choice. I think that it answers all of the questions that critics may raise, and whether California decided to stick with top two or consider the top four alternative. They're both good systems, and they're both infinitely better than with the known evils of partisan primaries. Nobody wants to go back to what from California perspective, voters' perspective, again, not the politicians' perspective, but from voters' perspective, it would be like going back to the dark ages. We've been freed. Why would we want to go back and re-enter a system in which we give the power, take power away from people and give it to political people and operatives and insiders? They are, the rest of whom we never get a chance to speak to. And I say that from the perspective of a former politician who spent 20 years as an insider. I know how it works. I know how partisan primaries are manipulated. I was a pro-choice Democrat representing the most conservative district west of the Mississippi, consistently represented by a Democrat. Every single campaign, I was the beneficiary of the Democratic Party manipulating the ballot by buying a libertarian candidate onto the ballot who was pro-life. Now, that was a cynical effort by the Democratic Party to protect me as a Democrat who was pro-choice in a district that in those days was majority pro-life. And so when I listen to all of this hair on fire nonsense about worrying about how a system can be manipulated, it's laughable for anybody who has a real political experience. Every system is going to be manipulated. Right now, they're voting in San Francisco and counting in San Francisco on their ranked choice system. That ranked choices, a whole bunch of candidates all the way down the line. And that counting will go for a long time. There were all kinds of alliances that were developed between different candidates and whatnot. And that you can't take the machinations and manipulation away from the mind of the consultant. But what I like about the top four ranked choice option is it preserves the nonpartisan character of and the power of the people as opposed to the political parties and whatnot. But it also provides more opportunity, as Richard has pointed out, to get more people on the ballot. And finally, by using ranked choice, it creates some degree of pressure against the political consultants to rely on negative campaigning. And I know that's not the core subject of what we're talking about here, but a lot of the poison in the system is rooted in all the negative campaigning that goes on both sides. And that they do it because it works. It works because they both keep doing it. And it is so destructive to democracy itself. And we should be not at all surprised that people walking away from the parties, I like to put it this way. If you went through 40 years of listening to McDonald's say that Jack in the Box hamburgers gave you salmonella or contained salmonella, and Jack in the Box saying that McDonald's hamburgers were full of botulism, pretty soon you just wouldn't buy hamburgers. And that's fundamentally what the political class in this country and the consultants that get paid and profit by doing it have done. They poisoned the democracy by over vilifying each other and saying things about each other they know that are exaggerated and not true at their core. And what has that done? It's meant a mass exodus of people who might otherwise participate in public office, and allowing those people who have the kind of hide that they're willing to not care what people say about them and can, and are willing to put up with it. So what do you think you get in the context of the folks that are willing to even participate in the system when you make the system so fundamentally vile? It goes, and I think the press has to take its share of responsibility for this. When one of our projects that we fund is IVN, Independent Voter Network, IVN.us. It allows anybody to publish. Richard has published on it many times. It allows anybody to participate. All you have to do is abide by the etiquette. Now, we'd like to invite, for example, invite Roseanne Barr and Samantha, what's her name? Samantha, losing track here. Samantha and Roseanne. We'd love to have them come and have a conversation just like this, but they'd have to abide by the etiquette. I'm not sure either one are capable of doing that, but until we bring some civility back to the process, we're always going to be sorely disappointed. And unfortunately, when you give the benefit of the power to corporate entities where the participants in the process get the anonymity of hiding behind that corporate veil, you encourage this kind of vile and negative histrionic activity that is absolutely in conflict with the fundamental principle of representative democracy, which is nothing more than an alternative to killing each other when we disagree about things. The halls of Congress, the state legislature should be places in which people come to make peace, not to continue their war with each other. And the war of words and the contempt that is exhibited by the principal folks that represent both political parties is destructive to the country. It's even ultimately destructive to themselves. I believe the Republican Party, the Libertarian Party, the Green Party, the Democratic Party, and other parties that may emerge will flourish in a nonpartisan environment in which they're rewarded for the content of their thought process, as opposed to the trickiness and the cleverness of the kind of shots they can take at each other. That's our goal. It's not going to happen overnight. We've made tremendous progress in California. Things are better in California by a wide margin than they were. You know, it's pretty easy to go back and look at where we were sitting and the dysfunction of the legislature and the difficulties we're having on a variety of fronts. And California sits in a much better place today, in large part because of top two open primaries. It, like everything else, is not perfect, and we're always open to entertaining other ideas. But we're not going to turn the clock back and go back to partisanship. It's what we ran away from. It's what we freed ourselves from, and we're never going back.
Steve, thank you. Richard, we're completely out of time, but I want to give you 30 seconds to respond to the idea of top four ranked choice voting. What do you think about that?
The law firm that has defended top two in court is the Nielsen Merksimer law firm. And the Nielsen Merksimer law firm also went to court, to federal court, to try to get rid of San Francisco's ranked choice voting. If Steve can persuade Charles Munger to support ranked choice voting, that will be quite an accomplishment. But I'd be surprised if that happens. And I also want to say the reason California government is better than it was in 2010 is because the voters passed Prop 25 that got rid of the rule that the budget had to pass by a 2/3 vote. As soon as that passed, that cured gridlock all by itself. So when people talk about California being better, they're right, but it had nothing to do with top two.
Great, thank you both for joining us.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks. I'm sure that 2018 is not the last time we will hear a debate about top two. We could even see a ballot measure to change the system in 2020, possibly to repeal or to replace with the top four ranked choice voting system. So maybe we will have more discussions in the future about this. Viewers, please tune in to our continued coverage of this year's primary in the States, and thank you for joining Ballotpedia's webinar on the top two primary system in California.
Thank you.